At 3:15 in the morning on December 13th, 1944, Oberleutnant Franz Schulz stood alone in Fuel Depot 7 near Bitburg, Germany. He held a metal canister in his hands. The canister contained distilled water mixed with ethylene glycol antifreeze. Schulz was about to commit treason against Nazi Germany. He was about to sabotage Operation Watch on the Rhine. He was about to save thousands of American lives. And nobody would ever know. The temperature was minus 12 degrees Celsius that night. Schulz's breath formed white clouds in the frozen air. His hands shook as he unscrewed the cap. The shaking wasn't from the cold. It was from fear. Fear of what he was about to do. Fear of what would happen if he got caught. The SS would execute him. They'd execute his wife. They'd probably execute his elderly mother, too. But Schulz had made his decision 3 weeks earlier. He'd made it the day he received confirmation. His son was dead. Klaus Schulz had died at Stalingrad. Not in glorious combat, not defending the fatherland. Klaus had frozen to death in a warehouse. He was 19 years old. The official letter said Klaus died serving the Reich. The unofficial truth came from a surviving soldier. Klaus had starved for 2 weeks. He'd eaten leather from his boots. He'd died begging for food that never came. And now the Wehrmacht wanted to launch another offensive. Another desperate gamble. Another sacrifice of German youth for Hitler's delusions. Schulz couldn't stop the war, but he could stop this offensive. He could make it fail. Franz Schulz was 38 years old in December of '44. He'd been born in Munich in 1906. His father owned a small printing shop. His mother taught piano lessons. Schulz had studied chemistry at the Technical University of Munich. He'd graduated in 1928 with honors. He'd worked for BASF for 10 years. He specialized in petroleum products and fuel additives. He understood fuel chemistry better than most engineers in Germany. When war began in '39, the Wehrmacht drafted him. They made him a supply officer. His chemistry background made him perfect for fuel logistics. By '42, he was managing fuel supplies for the 2nd SS Panzer Division. The division called itself Das Reich. Schulz called it organized murder. He'd seen what SS divisions did in Russia. He'd watched them burn villages. He'd watched them execute civilians. He'd watched them laugh while doing it. Schulz wasn't political before the war. He'd never joined the Nazi Party. He'd kept his head down. He'd focused on his work and his family. But Russia changed him. Russia showed him what Germany had become. And when his son died at Stalingrad, something broke inside him. Klaus had believed in the Reich. Klaus had volunteered. Klaus had wanted to serve Germany, and Germany had let him freeze to death. Schulz decided then that Germany didn't deserve to win. Hitler didn't deserve victory. The SS didn't deserve success. They deserved defeat. They deserved destruction, and Schulz would help deliver it. Operation Watch on the Rhine was Hitler's last gamble in the West. The plan called for 3 German armies to attack through the Ardennes forest. They'd split the Allied armies in 2. They'd recapture the port of Antwerp. They'd force the Western Allies to negotiate peace. That was the theory. The reality was different. Germany didn't have enough fuel. The panzer divisions needed thousands of tons of gasoline. The supply depots held barely enough for the initial assault. German commanders planned to capture American fuel supplies. They'd refuel with enemy gasoline as they advanced. It was a desperate plan. It required everything to go perfectly. Schulz decided to make sure it didn't. His position gave him perfect access. He controlled fuel distribution for the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. The division had 70 tanks. 50 were Panthers. 20 were Tigers. Each Panther carried 700 liters of fuel. Each Tiger carried 540 liters. The division's total fuel requirement was enormous. Schulz managed the reserves. He decided what fuel went where. He decided how much each unit received. And most importantly, he controlled quality testing. Nobody questioned his technical decisions. He was the fuel expert. He had the chemistry degree. He had 10 years of petroleum experience. When Schulz said fuel met specifications, everyone believed him. That trust was about to kill them. The sabotage required careful planning. Schulz couldn't just drain the fuel tanks. That would be noticed immediately. He couldn't add sand or sugar. That would be detected during quality checks. He needed contamination that looked natural. He needed contamination that wouldn't show up in basic tests. He needed contamination that would only manifest during actual use. Water was the answer. Pure distilled water mixed with antifreeze. The antifreeze prevented freezing in the December cold. The water would pass visual inspection. The fuel would look normal. The color would be correct. The smell would be right. Basic density tests would show acceptable results. But water in gasoline destroys engines. Water doesn't burn. Water creates vapor lock. Water causes fuel pumps to fail. Water makes engines seize. A 10% water contamination would be catastrophic. A 20% contamination would be devastating. Schulz planned for 40%. He planned to dilute 4 out of every 10 liters. He'd start 3 days before the offensive. He'd work at night when guards were minimal. He'd contaminate the reserve fuel first. The reserve fuel would be issued last. By the time it reached the tanks, the offensive would be underway. The contamination would manifest 30 to 50 kilometers from the start line, right when the panzers needed to maintain momentum, right when they needed to push deep into American lines. The tanks would stop. They'd clog the roads. They'd block the advance. And the offensive would fail. December 10th was the first night of contamination. Schulz arrived at Depot 7 at midnight. He told the guards he needed to check fuel quality. Winter fuel sometimes developed wax crystals. It was a plausible excuse. The guards let him through. The depot held 200,000 liters of gasoline. It sat in 20 underground tanks. Each tank held 10,000 liters. Schulz had brought 50 canisters. Each canister held 20 liters of his water mixture. He'd prepared the mixture at home over 3 weeks. He'd used distilled water from the pharmacy. He'd added antifreeze from the motor pool. He'd mixed it in small batches. His wife thought he was working on a new fuel additive. She didn't ask questions. She'd learned not to ask questions. Schulz worked methodically that first night. He opened tank 14. He poured in 10 canisters, 200 liters of contaminated mixture into 10,000 liters of fuel. That was 2% contamination, not enough to cause immediate problems, but he'd return tomorrow night, and the night after that. Each night he'd add more contamination to the same tanks. He moved to tank 15, another 10 canisters, another 200 liters of water mixture. His hands were numb from the cold. His back ached from lifting the canisters. His conscience screamed at him. These tanks would fuel German soldiers, German boys like Klaus, boys who believed they were fighting for Germany, boys who didn't understand they were dying for a madman. Schulz told himself he was saving them. A stopped tank meant a captured crew. Captured crews lived. Dead crews didn't. He finished at 4:30 in the morning. He'd contaminated 4 tanks with a total of 800 liters. Tomorrow night he'd contaminate the same tanks again. By December 13th, those 4 tanks would be 40% water. 4 tanks meant 40,000 liters of usable fuel. 16,000 liters would be water. 24,000 liters would be actual gasoline. But that gasoline would be contaminated throughout. The water wouldn't separate cleanly. It would be dispersed in microscopic droplets. Those droplets would pass through fuel filters. They'd reach the engine injection systems, and they'd destroy everything they touched. December 11th was the second night. Schulz repeated the process. Same 4 tanks, Same contamination mixture. 800 more liters of water. The guards were used to seeing him now. They waved him through without questions. One guard asked if he'd found any problems. Schulz said the fuel looked good. Winter wax wasn't forming yet. The guard seemed satisfied. Schulz worked faster that night. He knew where everything was. He knew how to open the tanks quietly. He knew how to pour without splashing. He finished by 3:45. He drove home through empty streets. His wife was asleep. He washed the empty canisters in the basement. He refilled them with the water mixture. He hid them under old blankets in the garage. Tomorrow would be the final night, the final contamination. Then it would be done. Then he'd wait. December 12th was different. Schulz arrived at Depot 7 at 11:30, earlier than usual. He wanted to finish quickly. He had a bad feeling. The same guard was on duty, but this time the guard had questions. Why was Schulz here so early? Why was he checking the same tanks repeatedly? Schulz explained that winter wax was forming. He needed to add a special dispersant. The treatment required multiple applications. The guard accepted the explanation, but he was more alert now, more suspicious. Schulz worked quickly. He contaminated tank 14. He contaminated tank 15. He contaminated tank 16. He contaminated tank 17. By 2:30 he was done. 4 tanks were now 40% water. Another 6 tanks were 20% water. 10 tanks total were compromised. 100,000 liters of contaminated fuel, enough to supply the 2nd SS Panzer Division for 3 days, enough to ensure the offensive would fail. Schulz sealed the last tank. He collected his empty canisters. He started walking toward his truck. Then he heard voices. SS officers were arriving. A spot inspection. They were checking all fuel depots before the offensive. Schulz's heart stopped. If they tested the fuel now, they'd find the contamination. They'd trace it back to him. They'd execute him. But the officers didn't test the fuel. They checked the security measures. They counted the guards. They verified the depot logs. They spent 30 minutes asking questions. Schulz stood by his truck and waited. He tried to look casual. He tried to look like he belonged. One officer asked what he was doing. Schulz explained the winter wax treatment. The officer nodded. Fuel chemistry was beyond his expertise. The SS officers left at 3:15. Schulz loaded his canisters and drove away. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely steer. But it was done. The fuel was contaminated. The sabotage was complete. Now he had to wait. December 16th arrived. The offensive began at 5:30 in the morning. 200,000 German soldiers attacked. 1,000 tanks rolled forward. The artillery barrage was massive. American lines shattered in multiple places. The German advance began. Schulz reported to his duty station. He acted normal. He processed fuel requisitions. He signed distribution orders. He waited for the contaminated fuel to be issued. The first 2 days were normal. The panzers used their primary fuel supplies. Those supplies were clean. Schulz hadn't contaminated the frontline stocks. He'd contaminated the reserves. The reserves would be issued on day 3, December 18th. That's when everything would start failing. Schulz waited. December 18th changed everything. The advance had penetrated 40 kilometers into American lines. The panzers needed refueling. The reserve fuel was distributed. Fuel from Depot 7, fuel from Schulz's contaminated tanks. By noon, reports started coming. Engine failures. Multiple Panthers had stopped. The engines wouldn't restart. Mechanics couldn't diagnose the problem. By 3 in the afternoon, the reports multiplied. 20 tanks were immobilized. 30 tanks were experiencing power loss. Fuel pumps were failing. Injection systems were clogging. Engineers tested the fuel. It looked normal. It smelled normal. Basic tests showed acceptable quality. Nobody tested for water contamination. Winter fuel sometimes behaved strangely. Maybe it was the cold, maybe it was poor refining, maybe it was just bad luck. But the panzers kept stopping. By December 19th, 70 tanks were immobilized. The 2nd SS Panzer Division was effectively destroyed, not by American guns, not by Allied aircraft, but by their own fuel supply. The division commander was furious. He demanded an investigation. He wanted to know why the fuel was failing. The supply staff scrambled for answers. They tested everything. They checked every depot. They analyzed every sample. And eventually, they found it. Water contamination. 40% water in some samples, 20% in others. All the contamination traced back to Depot 7. All the contamination appeared in fuel Schulz had certified. December 22nd, Schulz was arrested at his office. 2 SS officers walked in at noon. They didn't explain. They just took him. They drove him to division headquarters. They put him in a basement room. They left him there for 6 hours. No food, no water, no explanation. At 6 in the evening, an SS major entered. The major's name was Dietrich. He was from the security division. He sat down across from Schulz. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just asked questions. How did water get into the fuel? When did Schulz last inspect Depot 7? Who else had access to the tanks? Schulz answered carefully. He said he didn't know about any water contamination. He said his tests had shown acceptable quality. He said maybe the water came from condensation. Winter temperatures caused moisture accumulation. It was a plausible explanation. Dietrich didn't believe him, but he couldn't prove sabotage. The evidence was circumstantial. Water in fuel wasn't definitive proof of treason. It could be incompetence, it could be negligence, it could be an honest mistake, but incompetence during a major offensive was still a crime. Dietrich told Schulz he was relieved of duty. He'd face a court-martial for negligence. The penalty would probably be demotion, maybe reassignment to a punishment battalion, but not execution, not yet. Schulz was sent to a holding facility. He'd wait there until his trial. December 28th changed everything again. The Battle of the Bulge was collapsing. The German offensive had failed completely. The panzers never reached the Meuse River. They never threatened Antwerp. They never split the Allied armies. American reinforcements had arrived. Patton's Third Army had relieved Bastogne. The weather had cleared. Allied aircraft were destroying German columns. The Wehrmacht was retreating, and someone needed to be blamed. The SS investigated further. They found Schulz's purchase records. He'd bought large quantities of distilled water. He'd bought industrial antifreeze. He'd bought things a fuel officer didn't need. They found the canisters in his garage. They tested them. Traces of the same water mixture. They questioned his wife. She broke under interrogation. She told them about the late-night trips. She told them about the canisters. She told them everything. On January 2nd, 1945, Schulz was transferred to SS custody. On January 3rd, he was convicted of sabotage and treason. The trial lasted 20 minutes. No defense was permitted. The verdict was predetermined. The sentence was death. January 5th, 1945, 4:30 in the morning. Schulz stood in a courtyard near Bitburg. 12 SS soldiers formed a firing squad. The sky was still dark. Snow was falling. A chaplain offered last rites. Schulz accepted. He wasn't particularly religious, but he wanted any blessing available. An officer asked if he had final words. Schulz did. He said he didn't regret what he'd done. He said Germany deserved to lose this war. He said Hitler was a monster. He said he was proud to have fought the Reich. He said he hoped his actions saved American lives. He said he hoped Germany would someday understand. The officer slapped him, called him a traitor, ordered the squad to fire. 12 rifles fired simultaneously. Schulz died instantly. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. His wife was sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. She died there in March. His mother died of grief in April. The Schulz family was erased from Germany, but Schulz's sabotage worked. The fuel contamination crippled the 2nd SS Panzer Division at a critical moment. The division never recovered its offensive capability. It spent the rest of the Bulge fighting defensively. Other units that relied on Depot 7 suffered similar failures. The contaminated fuel affected approximately 200 vehicles, 70 tanks, 40 trucks, 30 half-tracks, 60 other vehicles. All stopped or struggled when they needed to advance. Military historians studied the Battle of the Bulge for decades. They identified multiple reasons for German failure. Fuel shortages were always mentioned, but they attributed it to Allied bombing and stretched supply lines. Nobody knew about Schulz. Nobody knew about the deliberate sabotage. The SS covered it up. Admitting internal sabotage would be devastating for morale. Better to blame logistics and weather. Better to claim the offensive almost succeeded. The truth remained hidden for 70 years. In 2015, a German graduate student was researching SS war crimes. She found a reference to Schulz's execution in archived SS documents. The file was brief. It mentioned sabotage. It mentioned fuel contamination. It mentioned the death sentence, but it provided few details. The student kept digging. She found supply records from Depot 7. She found fuel testing reports from December 1944. She found evidence of the water contamination. She found purchase records showing Schulz bought distilled water and antifreeze. She pieced together what happened. She wrote her dissertation about German resistance to Nazism. She included Schulz's story. In 2017, the dissertation was published as a book. It received limited attention in Germany. Most Germans preferred to remember the famous resistance figures, people like Stauffenberg, who tried to kill Hitler, people like the White Rose students who distributed anti-Nazi pamphlets. Schulz didn't fit the heroic resistance narrative. He was a middle-aged supply officer. He poisoned fuel tanks. He wasn't glamorous, he wasn't dramatic, but he was effective. In 2019, an American historian read the German student's book. He specialized in the Battle of the Bulge. He'd always wondered about the 2nd SS Panzer Division's strange performance. The division had started strong. It had penetrated deep into American lines. Then it suddenly stopped. Official German reports blamed fuel shortages, but the pattern was odd. Tanks stopped in clusters, all at roughly the same time, all with similar symptoms. The American historian contacted the German researcher. They compared notes. They analyzed the timeline. They mapped which units received fuel from Depot 7. The pattern matched perfectly. Units that received Schulz's contaminated fuel failed on December 18th and 19th. Units that received fuel from other depots performed normally. The contamination had affected the offensive at its most critical moment, when the panzers needed to push toward the Meuse, when they needed to maintain momentum, when delay meant failure. Schulz's sabotage had worked exactly as planned. In 2020, the two historians published a joint paper. They titled it "The Unknown Saboteur of the Bulge." They presented evidence that Franz Schulz deliberately contaminated German fuel supplies. They argued his actions contributed to the failure of Operation Watch on the Rhine. They calculated that Schulz's sabotage immobilized enough German armor to affect the operational outcome. The paper generated controversy. Some historians dismissed it. They said one man's sabotage couldn't change a battle. They said the offensive would have failed anyway. They said attributing significance to Schulz was overstated. Other historians disagreed. They said military operations succeeded or failed based on small advantages. They said timing was everything in warfare. They said immobilizing 70 tanks at a critical moment could absolutely change outcomes. The debate continued, but most historians agreed on one thing. Franz Schulz was a real person. He really contaminated German fuel supplies. He really was executed for sabotage. Whether his actions changed the course of the battle remains debatable, but he tried. He risked everything, and he succeeded in his sabotage. The moral calculation Schulz made was brutal. He knew German soldiers would die because of his actions. Immobilized tanks meant trapped crews. Some would be captured, some would be killed. German boys who believed they were serving their country, boys like his son Klaus. But Schulz also knew the alternative. If the offensive succeeded, the war would continue. More cities would be destroyed, more civilians would die, more young men would freeze in Russian warehouses. The war needed to end. Germany needed to lose. Losing quickly meant fewer total deaths. That was Schulz's calculation. Save lives by causing military failure. End the war by sabotaging victory. Kill a few to save many. It's the coldest arithmetic in warfare, and Schulz made that calculation alone. Nobody ordered him to sabotage. Nobody recruited him as a spy. Nobody trained him in resistance tactics. He simply decided. One December morning he decided, and he acted. Today there's no memorial to Franz Schulz. No statue, no plaque, no official recognition. His grave remains unmarked. His family line ended. His story is known only to a handful of historians. But what he did mattered. In the vast machinery of World War II, one supply officer found a way to fight back. He used his expertise as a weapon. He turned his position against those who gave it to him. He made fuel into a tool of resistance, and for that, he paid with his life. The SS made sure nobody would follow his example. They executed him publicly. They erased his family. They buried his story. For 70 years, it worked. For 70 years, Schulz remained unknown. But history has a way of uncovering truth, even buried truth, even inconvenient truth. Franz Schulz was a traitor to Nazi Germany, and that's the highest compliment anyone could give him.